Over the weekend, the Pentagon halted plans to vaccinate 40 wartime prisoners at the U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay. It comes after the Department of Defense faced criticism for announcing it would give the COVID-19 vaccine to all detainees there on a voluntary basis. A Pentagon spokesman later confirmed that plans had been paused as the department reviewed protection protocols. New York Times reporter Carol Rosenberg recently wrote about this. She has been covering Guantanamo Bay for nearly 20 years and joins me now from Washington. Carol, welcome. Thanks very much for joining us. Why were prisoners at Guantanamo Bay first prioritized, and when were they expected to receive shots?
So they began vaccinating the medical staff on the base early in January. And then they expanded out to other residents and other troops who live down there. And it is unclear whether everybody who wanted a vaccine on that base got it. But at some point, the decision was made to then move on to vaccinating the prisoners. There's 40 prisoners down there. This had been, I was told even prior to this administration that the intention was to vaccinate the prisoners. It was a matter of timing. Guantanamo has 6,000 people there, and there's at the prison itself, there are 1,500 National Guard troops, and they come and go on rotations. And when they arrive, they go into 2 weeks quarantine, and then they go to their assignments at the prison. So I think what had happened is they started with the guards, with the medical personnel. They moved on to the guards, and then they announced last week, they told the lawyers for these men that they were going to offer them on a voluntary basis starting this week for the prisoners. There's 40 prisoners, so it was a maximum of 40 doses plus the booster. But, it really struck a nerve with the American public among those people who are still waiting their turn.
Yeah, you mentioned these 1,500 troops serving at Guantanamo Bay. You say that it's sort of a rotating group. What do we know about the vaccination status of those 1,500 troops?
They announced in early January that they'd managed to vaccinate all the medical troops. There's about 100 or so Navy corpsmen assigned to the prison operation to take care of both the National Guard forces, the soldiers, as well as the prisoners there. And they managed to vaccinate those. And they also vaccinated all the workers at the hospital and the people at the airport and the seaport who would have contact with outsiders. What I don't know, what the Trump administration and now the Biden administration is not disclosing is how many people voluntarily took the vaccines, because it's voluntary in the U.S. military, how many chose not to do it, and whether they had concluded all of the first round of the residents down there who wanted it before they moved on to offering them to the prisoners. I think you may know that there's plans to charge 3 men later this month. There had been plans to charge 3 men later this month who had never been to court in their 18, 17 years of confinement by the United States. And so they would be leaving the prison and heading over to the court, where they would be having contact with a number of people who would have flown in on a special charter. We were going to leave on Thursday, undergo 2 weeks of quarantine, and then go to the courtroom to cover this extraordinary arraignment. And the timetable that had been planned, that was suspended over the weekend, would have given those men both their vaccine and their booster by the time they were brought over to the courthouse with the judge and the prosecution and all the staff that had come in from the United States. Gitmo has done a pretty good job of keeping the virus out, as best as we can tell. They're very secretive down there about it. They disclosed 2 instances of sailors who had been infected and were quarantined back in March, April, and then they stopped telling us. But it seems that they've been managing to bring people coming and going on and off the island with these quarantine protocols to protect everybody. The other thing is that it's really relaxed down there recently. People were allowed to bring family members, and people have been coming and going to some degree on vacations, as long as they take these quarantine procedures quite seriously and the testing.
I had no idea. It's really fascinating and eye-opening to hear that. It's not one of those places that one would think would be sort of accessible to many other people. So let's talk about this trial that you mentioned, because according to your reporting, the Pentagon approved the trial of 3 Guantanamo Bay prisoners the day after President Biden's inauguration. This is the first trial at the base since 2014. What more can you tell us about this case? It's extraordinary to think about the time frame here that you spelled out. We mentioned at the top, you've been covering Gitmo for, as it's called, for nearly 20 years. Well, that's about the time that it's been open, really, since the very beginning. So tell us about this case.
So these 3 men are going to court, were charged in the first new prosecution since the Obama administration. During the Trump years, they didn't charge any more prisoners. But this case had been laying around. It involves an Indonesian man known as Hambali, who is said to have been the leader of the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Indonesia during the Bali bombings, at the time of the Bali bombings. And 2 men who were brought to Gitmo as his, let's say, associates, who were Malaysian. And they're accused of having a role in these bombings back in 2002-03. And the decision on why to charge them and go forward now is a bit of a mystery. It was approved by a Pentagon official who was installed in the job during the last administration. You know, when the Obama administration came on, when President Obama took over, they put a halt to the war crimes court down there to evaluate its effectiveness and the fairness of the trials and to some degree the constitutionality of it. They reformed it, and then in 2012 they charged 5 men as conspirators in the September 11th bombings. Well, that case has not come to trial. It's been in pretrial proceedings and has been on hold for a year. So now they've added another case, but in the meantime, in the course of the pandemic, there's been virtually no progress in any of these military trials. So, like I said, it's a bit of a mystery why it happened on day 1.5 of the Biden administration, but it launched a clock and some complications for the new White House about what to do about this case, because really by this military commissions law that was established after 9/11, they're supposed to be brought to court within 30 days of charging. Now, these men were captured 17 years ago by the local authorities and handed over to the CIA and didn't get to Guantanamo Bay until 2006. This, whenever they make it to court, if they make it to court, will be the first time the public will have seen them, the first time they will have been charged in a court proceeding during their entire detention.
You know, it is just, I think, remarkable for some Americans who may not realize just how, again, long this particular time frame is. The 5 prisoners accused of plotting September 11th attacks still being held in Guantanamo Bay. I mean, what more can you tell us about their cases? Because a lot of folks may be wondering, this is taxpayer money. Why is it that these cases have not gone to trial?
So in the 9/11 cases, it's called, the men were taken off to the CIA black sites after their arrest and interrogated with waterboarding and other what they called enhanced interrogation techniques that amounted to torture. And so whatever they said when they were in the CIA black sites has been pretty much ruled inadmissible in their trials. So that you have the first complication of, rather than when they captured them in Pakistan back in 2002 and 2003, picking them up, taking them to New York and putting them on federal trial, they disappeared them into the black sites for 3 and 4 years. And then they brought them to Guantanamo. Then they re-interrogated them. And then they began the process of trying to charge them. But these are death penalty trials. Death penalty trials involve access to lots of evidence, presumably, very talented teams of defense lawyers, and the CIA and the intelligence community have a certain level of control over what evidence they can see, and there's an entire process ongoing to make substitutes and sort of shield the identities of people who were involved in the CIA program. It's not your straightforward trial of having picked them up and charged them. The intervening years of their detention, particularly with the CIA, have made it very difficult for this government, the last government, all of the U.S. government since the Bush administration, to turn over the evidence that the defense lawyers need. And to some degree, you know, we've had a series of judges, and some of the judges have found the evidence that would lacking or insufficient to give these men a fair trial. If you want to take people to trial in a capital case with the ultimate goal of executing them, there's a higher standard. And so there's a lot of scrutiny on how this trial would proceed. There had been a trial date. It was supposed to begin, but as I said, it's been on hold for more than a year, and they've lost a year of progress towards this. We're coming up on the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, and right now, any timetable that we have that we can imagine would not have that trial even begun with jury selection. Jury selection in this case is military officers who could be brought from around the world. If they even tried to do it in this case or in another case during COVID, they'd have to quarantine them and keep them in isolation to make sure they don't bring COVID onto the island. You know, the idea of the vaccines is to protect everyone. One of the things I failed to mention is Guantanamo is a base, has 6,000 people. It has Navy families and sailors and school, you know, and schools and school teachers. So the goal is just to make sure that keep it off the island, keep it off the base. And if somehow it comes in with somebody who's asymptomatic spreading it, to make sure that it gets, you know, snuffed out through quarantines and doesn't spread through this population. So.
I mean, it's an incredibly complex legal situation, further complicated by the pandemic. All right, Carol Rosenberg of the New York Times. Carol, thank you very much for sharing your reporting with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.